Hi there, it's Bernie. I'm the organizer of the Eamon meetup in Toronto, and another video in regards to the wonderful and extraordinary work that we're doing inside of the detection arts. And today I'm going to be mentioning to you the place that detection holds in an individual's spiritual journey. And there's a massive mistake that's made by so many people in regards to having a spiritual life. And it goes along the lines of this. People think that they can do things just because they are who they are. So for example, there's an assumption that people have that they know how to approach what it means to have a spiritual life. They assume that they have the capacity to be able to make the right choices and decisions. I would liken it to, for example, if you put a person out in the middle of a field and ask them which direction is north, and say the sun isn't so clearly identifiable as coming up in the east or setting in the west, and it's hard to know what direction is north. The person would maybe look around for some types of clues, but they really wouldn't be able to determine which way is north unless they were familiar with the area, unless there was some nuances of the space that they were in that they knew how to read, and then they could surmise from their observation that direction is north. Well, take for example the idea of a spiritual life, meaning heading in a specific type of direction. And the question is do you have an orientation for what is a correct spiritual direction for your life to travel in? See, it makes sense. Nobody would, for example, walk into a hospital and into a surgery theater where there's a person who has been made unconscious lying before them, and someone just hands you a scalpel and says, do you mind performing an appendectomy on this individual? They need it desperately. If you've never cut into somebody's flesh and you've never studied what it means to be a surgeon and understand, about anatomy and all of these things, you'd step back and say, I'm not equipped for the job. Well, when it comes time for a spiritual journey, for moving your life in a direction that has a much greater, deeper meaning than it does now, there's training that's required, or at least some type of capacity to understand what it is that you're doing. And here's where, in so many cases, what people will do, they'll turn to some ancient documents, they'll turn to some old books, they'll turn to practices from thousands of years ago. And there's another error inside of this. And I'll tell you how it seems to me is that these practices that were made hundreds or thousands of years ago were in a different time. They were in a different ecology. There were, in a sense, different spiritual enhancements available then than there are now. Because all of life is growing and it's developing and it's refining. And so, for example, the capacity of humans to connect with higher forces that would, for example, illuminate them to some degree. The forces that existed 1,000 years ago, well, they're different today because everything modifies, changes, and alters as time goes on. Everything does. And that goes for spiritual concepts also, or personal development concepts, or those things that would influence you. So this brings me around to the concept of detection. And the idea being behind detection is that it's getting yourself aware of the fundamental aspects of existence on planet Earth so that you're actually able to make correct orientation of the direction that you're going in by being able to identify, understand, and comprehend the influences of life. And once again, people think, well, I've been to university, or I've worked in a high-level position, or I have these experiences. And once again, I'll go back to another analogy where just because you're you doesn't mean you could say, for example, take an airplane to Asia and disembark from the plane and walk out and completely understand Asian culture and be able to speak Mandarin, for example. The likelihood of that happening just spontaneously it's practically impossible. So what is it in a person that, and I see it and I hear it so often, I'm on a spiritual journey, and I think, well, what are the tools that you're bringing to play in regards to readying yourself for that to actually become a meaningful reality? Or is it that you're in a type of fantasy spiritualism? Is it that you'll prefer to perhaps draw some ideas uh, from Gnosticism, for example, and have a little smattering of Buddhism in there, and not even necessarily examine that, for example, a great deal of your value system would have been cultured as it as you grew up steeped within a Judeo-Christian value system that is so much of the depth of the persuasion of North Americans, and be able to understand where you're coming from. So people with their concept of wanting to be spiritual seem to make a fundamental assumption that they have the skills and the arts and the training to be able to pursue that in a meaningful fashion. And well, I don't want to discourage someone from wanting to engage with the higher aspects of life and wanting to find meaning, but I'm definitely not want to discourage it, but very much want to encourage the correct approach. And the correct approach is not dogmatic. You see, there's nobody who can teach someone else how to be spiritual. It just doesn't happen. Each life is completely unique. And what could be spiritual for one could be meaningless for the other. And what in the case of the student who could find maybe some spiritual meaning in understanding organic life, say plant life, but their teacher happens to disregard plant life, and that teacher found their spiritual root, say, for example, in understanding the human design and the human soul. If that teacher discourages the student from exploring the organic life of planet Earth, they might be diverting that individual away from the very inquiry and curiosity that could be leading them right into an incredible field of spiritual realization. So there's no way that an individual can teach another how to be spiritual. But if there is a set of skills, perceptions, a way to hone one's faculty so that each person themselves can observe life and be able to find out what it is that is their own spiritual journey, what is their route to real development, it requires a lot of work, and that skill set is what detection is about. So the detection arts that we work on, although it's, a variety of interesting subjects like numerology or astrology or palmistry, or a lot of human psychology enters into it also, and many other subjects. This is meant to be like a broad spectrumed introduction to the concepts that exist for a person to pick up any one of these tools and begin to orientate themselves in a more fine-tuned manner to the spiritual direction that they're going in. And in a sense, going back to the analogy that we began with, you have the individual who's standing out in the middle of the field, and you ask them which way is north. Detection is like handing them a compass. They can observe and use their faculties and perception and identify with the pointing of a compass which way is north. And so The detection tools are, in a way, an array of compasses that help for a person to find direction. And that direction is whatever that self-chosen direction of that individual happens to be. But to just randomly stand in a field and spin around and point in a direction and say that's north, and you can't necessarily validate it, chances are that it's not north. And to just randomly choose to call yourself a spiritual person, but you don't have the tools to direct you in the right manner, then I would assume that that has to be a fantasy spiritual life also. So the detection arts are about people who have a serious inclination towards wanting to pursue the higher aspects of life with an accuracy. And that accuracy comes from honing their own perceptive capability to really have a deeper understanding of the meaning of things. And that meaning is very unique towards each individual. So detection arts, in a way, is a set of tools that go in the kit bag of the stalwart spiritual journeyer, so that they own the direction that they move in and have greater accuracy in the decisions that they make. So that's what I wanted to say today about the detection arts. We're going to carry on with Fantastic, and hope to see you there.